And one thing that she mentioned that I do want to reiterate is the need to constantly reflect, and this is a lifelong process. If you think about your career and kind of the number of years that you'll spend in it, you're always evolving and evaluating and gathering information all the time. So on the one hand, that's good, but one thing that we have as faculty members that is a big part of our charge is we have to get in that classroom in January, and we have to have a syllabus in order to do that. And so one thing I would like to talk about is, during my time, is how do you make this very static document, your syllabus, how can you infuse it with diverse concepts, content, different ways of assessing students? And so you take it from this very one-dimensional static document into something that's much more interesting and enlightening for your students. So the theoretical viewpoint that I'm going to look at is more cantata. Does anyone know that work? I've heard of them before. So what they've come up with is this idea of multicultural course change and ways that you can infuse diversity, multicultural concepts into your actual classroom setting, not just in terms of the syllabus, but in terms of course policies, the way that you interact with your students. So it was wonderful to hear you all talk about what Sophia is doing in her classroom. And so what I'll do is I'll go through this kind of 3x4 grid to show you specifically how you can take a course, and even if you think that it is one course that can never have diverse concepts in it, can never have multicultural principles associated with it, how you can make that course really come to life and incorporate some of these ideas so that students get a very well-rounded experience in class. Okay. So if we go back to this first slide, so I have the arrow showing where I'm going to talk about different levels of change. So the first one is called exclusive. So in this case, diversity, kind of the principles of multiculturalism are relegated to the periphery, right? So I have here, and this is a bit of a pop quiz, does anyone know the 4 F's? When you think about diversity in classrooms and in courses, anyone heard of the 4 F's?
Food festivals.
There you go. So food, yes, is one for sure. What's another one? So along with festivals,
what's it?
Fun, so celebrations, right? So it's Women's History Month, oh, Black History Month, oh, Hispanic Heritage Month, right? So that's our second F. Anyone know the third one?
Facts.
So food, fun, and what?
Facts.
Facts. No, we don't do that. Fashion is another one, right? And then the fourth one is folklore. So, facts, So the idea here is that when you're looking at courses that have diversity kind of at an exclusive level, these ideas are relegated to the margin. So it's kind of an add-on, like a sprinkling, if you will. So we talk about the accomplishments of women in March, right? We talk about the accomplishments of Black Americans in February, right? So it's not necessarily fused throughout the curriculum. It's just kind of, we'll add it on, we'll sprinkle it in, we'll kind of get it in where we can, okay? If we look at the inclusive level, we're doing a little bit better, okay? So maybe we have the 4 F's, but we add a couple of facts in there, right? The idea here that I want to draw your attention to is this idea that instruction is still basically teacher-centered. In other words, I'm not interested in having my students kind of give me their perceptions and their experiences. I'm going to basically run the show. And so anything that comes from these discussions is really tightly held by me as the instructor. And so certainly this is a little bit better than being at the exclusive level. We're trying some other instructional methods and different ways to assess students and see that they've mastered the content. But we're not quite where we want to be. So here's where we want to go now. Transform. Just a term, you think about transformation, change, right? So from the inside out. And I hear a lot of what you're doing, Sophia. I know, I need to like grounded in this. Exactly. So your students were talking about how we really do think about not just the content, but how it relates to our own personal stories. How we can take our personal stories and affect change long term. And so if we're thinking about how to take a very static course, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to play around with some different courses and transform them in a minute. We take this static course on paper. How do I get my students to think about, right here, right, how they take ownership of the information? How do they take ownership of the content, right? How do they do assessments and interact with each other in a way that makes it much more relevant to their experience. Okay? So let's go back out to our original grid. Now I'm going to talk about 4 different elements that Moria Kutado talked about in terms of multicultural course change. Okay? So again, if you're looking at your syllabus, getting prepared for January, how can I look at things like content, assessment, right? So we're not just going to do tests and papers and portfolios. We're going to do something a little bit different and interesting. The dynamics is a lot about what you guys just mentioned, how you interact with each other in the classroom. So let's look at content more specifically. So this would apply to any discipline. So this doesn't have to be teacher ed. It just doesn't have to be humanities. It can be any type of discipline that you're interested in sharing information about. So if we're looking at content, I want to make sure that I'm selecting textbooks, readings, assignments that will hopefully express different viewpoints. And I'll give you an example of my Human Growth and Development course. So anyone who's taken Psych 101, you know about the Piagets, right? You know about the Bowlby, you know about Freud. Who are they? Someone describe who they are.
White men.
White men. Yes. And who did they study to get in the textbook?
White men.
Right. Middle class and upper middle class, right? And so if you just look at my textbook for my course, for my pre-service teachers, it's very static. It's very, you know, just white male, upper middle class examples. So we get to Mary Ainsworth, I get excited. When we get to Diana Baumright, I get very excited, right? Because now we have some women coming into the mix. And so one thing that Sophia talked about at length was race and class to a certain degree, but I want to bring in some other things such as gender, language diversity, certainly ability in terms of those of us who are able-bodied, right? Thinking about things such as sexual orientation. So how do those people make an impact content on this course? Okay? So if I just use my textbook, my students don't see anyone other than a white, upper middle class male until about chapter 12 out of 19, right? So I really have to take ownership of what they're exposed to. Say, okay, well, Mary Ainsworth was a student of Bowlby, so let's talk about her contribution to developmental psychology. Okay, so that's content. How do we bring in different viewpoints into the course? Instructional activity. So I don't know if you can tell in the picture, but the instructor is in the background. He's not in the forefront, he's in the background, right? So how do I, while I'm in the classroom with students, how do I get them to connect with the information, connect with the content, and provide them opportunities to do the group discussions, to do the debates, right? To do some peer tutoring. Okay, so I don't understand this concept, so instead of you always coming to me as the instructor, how do I build a sense of community with students that they feel comfortable going to each other for support and encouragement, right? So instructional activities. Here you can see things that, again, Sophia's doing a lot of this in her classroom, I am as well, where if students are doing a presentation, I'm not the only one who evaluates them. Your group will evaluate you as well. So don't always look to me as the instructor to be the one to give you evaluation and feedback. Look at your peers as well, right? So again, taking it away from the instructor-centered approach to a more student-centered approach. Assessment. And I actually picked this clip art for a reason. As you can see, the magnifying glass is magnifying what? Me. Yeah. So a lot of times instructors will pick assessments that are very traditional. The tests, the quizzes, the papers. And that's fine, they have their place. But if you're thinking about course change, right, how to transform your course, how to make it applicable to students, how can they see themselves, me, in the work, how to make it relevant, let's try some other things, right? So let's do some websites, right, Bob? And Ian, right? Let's do videos, PSAs, public service announcements. So if we're talking about family involvement, if we're talking about attachment, if we're talking about business models, if we're trying to look at underserved populations in terms of business or medicine or anything like that, let's do some PSAs as an assessment. Group presentations. I love doing debates with students, right? And one thing I'll talk about when we get to classroom dynamics is not just teaching how to debate, but also the civility and the respect that comes with that, right? So it's one thing to have your position and to defend it, right, or to advance it, but how do you do that with civility and respect? Journaling, reflective activities, action research. So remember that first slide I talked about, we want to make sure that students see how they can actually affect change, right? So I'm taking this course, I'm doing this assessment, I'm learning this information, but how do I take this then and go out into my community, into my world, and make something better, greater, bigger, right? So action research is a wonderful way to do that. And students get an opportunity to learn different methodologies. And then lastly, classroom dynamics. I'm going a little quickly because we're running a little long on time and I want to have Ashley be able to do her presentation. At its core, you can build the best course, the most interesting course to you, but if students are in the classroom feeling guarded, right, something you mentioned, feeling very comfortable and at ease, they feel scared, they feel anxious or fearful to share, to interact, to relate to each other, then all of that's for naught. You can take the best text and the best readings, have the greatest assessments and assignments, but if students don't feel comfortable, if they don't feel close to each other, right? They don't feel a sense of positivity when they're with you, then it really will not work. The course will fail, in essence. One thing we talk about in educational psychology is that when you look at the brain-based learning research, learning is always minimized when students feel fear, when they feel scared, when they feel that they can't take a risk and fail. One thing I tell my students, don't ever raise your hand and say, I know this is a stupid question, but that's not allowed in my class. The only stupid question is what? The one that's, right. And so students are kind of, back to Sophia's point about 18, 19 years of kind of training, right? To say, well, let me preface this with saying I'm really not sure, I'm not, no, there's no room for that in here. Ask your questions, get feedback, get the support you need, right? Okay, so here's what I want to do. One thing that I hear a lot is, that sounds good, Keonya. You're doing pre-service teachers, you're training students who want to become teachers. You're talking about really interesting, fun things like psychology and development. I'm over in business, I'm in bio, I'm in chemistry, I'm in computer science. So how can I get these diverse elements into my classroom? Right? How can I infuse them into my course? And what I tell people is, if you can hit all 4 out of 4, perfect, that's great, that's wonderful. But even if you can't hit all 4, can you hit 1 or 2, right? So maybe if your content doesn't lend itself to a lot of diverse perspectives per se, can you look at how your assessments can be a little bit more diverse, right? So not just tests and quizzes and papers, but something else outside of the box. Can you do that? So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you an opportunity, and you guys can try this if you'd like. So here's what I did. I went to the course catalog and I pulled out some course descriptions of these 4 courses. So we have a bio course, computer science course, a psych course, and an English course. And so I have the course description listed for you. And what I want you to do with your group is I want you to, based on whether I did your content, instructional activities, assessment, or classroom dynamics, I want you to take what we just talked about and see how can you infuse that type of diversity into the classroom based on the course description. Now I'm going to tell you, some of these are rough. So the computer science one, difficult. The bio one, genetics, I never took it, but so I don't know if I can help that group, but we'll see what we come up with. So who would like the biology one? Sure. I was just saying, this should be you. So we'll have this instructional activities.
Brian over
I'm not stuck. types of ways that you can write students. So that's how we think about diversity too. So not just a very traditional way of doing.
So is this I'm sorry. I'm hoping that you know the answer to this, Nina. Is this a course about how to actually program artificial intelligence, or is this just to learn about what they are doing?
I think it's better to learn,
You know, in more than schools have a fundraiser.
Which the other poll is for the students that are in your class.
Well, the stuff where they're actually designing projects, they're actually together, right? I don't know, does that mean writing code? I don't know.
Those 4 phases.
Something that I saw a lot of
What can you do
where there's
How can you have your students focus on praise, collaboration, ability, and respect? So what can you do to make that? Students will be far more critical.
a lot of times what can happen in those situations, designed it well.
And always use PSA
Well, let me ask a kind of fundamental question about that because this is at least anecdotally something that I've been quite a bit in university. Is that it's very easy to design neglect, create structures, and reproduce that, and you're have 4 white kids and a black kid, white kids get together and talk. And I've heard that the same story several times.
So that's one of the reasons to like so get them as opposed to who speaks up the fastest.
And I had 2 of them in the room. Just like you. So I say that to them kind of, but they still don't speak up. Whereas like other she'll do that in the correct answer. The questions later. But I do like your idea.
Okay.
Although I think it's a really good idea, but it seems like there needs to be a step onto something else, because ultimately you want
So for each group, can you just read maybe 2 sentences of your course description so we get a feel for it, maybe not the full paragraph, and what you came up with? So we have our content group that has a biology course, 300 level, genetics. Okay, so Bob, can you just read a couple
That's
sentences?
us. The course description is the basics of the science of heredity. The course encompasses Mendelian genetics, the molecular basis of inheritance, changes in chromosome number and structure, et cetera, et cetera.
Fun, right? Sounds interesting.
Yeah, the most important piece of information we got out of this is we are mutts. And we were discussing comparing Mendelian genetics to the human genome, tying this into what we're talking about here, that race and I put it in quotations, is based on phenotype. But if you were to look at true genetics, that we're really pretty much all the same.
All these big admixes. I use the word admixes. I didn't use the word much.
I got nuts from her.
Okay, so great example of how to infuse content. Right now, on the surface, you would think genetics, I don't know how that would work, right? And it might be a little bit sensitive, or right? But I think that's a perfect way of looking at the fact that at the genotypic level, we're pretty much all the same. Phenotypically, how it's expressed is different. Good, okay.
Helps to have scientists with you too.
Yes, that's why we did that. So Dina, can you just maybe read 2 sentences from yours? This is a comp sci course.
A course introducing fundamental techniques for artificial intelligence. Among topics covered are heuristic search, knowledge representation, intelligent agents, reasoning, neural networks, blah, blah, blah.
Is that what you want when you read through the course? Okay, so you guys had discussion activities. So remember, diversity not necessarily in this very black and white way, literally or figuratively, right? But diversity in terms of the course, right? What kind of different ways and viewpoints can I express to students in terms of how I introduce the content? So what did you guys come up with?
So we talked about how, so instructional activities, you say selecting tools to augment critical thinking, decision-making, group interaction, social participation, encouraging students to take risks, make mistakes, etc. So we talked about group projects, and we talked about scaffolding those so that there were pieces that were accessible that then would lead to other questions. And even if the instructor had levels of questions prepared, that way the students, at least sometimes, would lead themselves to what would have been the next question that the instructor would have introduced. And we were struggling with the fact that in groups, students interact in different ways. Sure. They bring their own social dynamics to the way that they interact in class. And we were about to say, we were about to talk about an idea, one approach to deal with that. And there have been various approaches already proposed. But another one that we hadn't talked about yet is that if you give students role, like for example, if students are working a problem at the board and you select the student who's going to present at the board, but the idea is that the whole team is doing it, and it's not that student by themselves that they're doing it, and everyone else is telling them what to do, then that's a valuable way to get students to learn to be cooperative and to have a team philosophy in approach to the work instead of a competitive individual sort of approach.
And even if they individually are not fully prepared, right, to go up there, at least they have the support of others encouraging them.
Right.
Good. Great. Anything else your group wants to add? Thank you. Okay. Psych of gender assessment. So, variety of assessments.
Yeah, so we talked. Did you see? Oh, sure. Sorry. The course presents social, cognitive, biological, evolutionary, and cross-cultural perspectives on gender, including gender development and roles, major themes, gender differences versus similarities, gender versus sex, influence of gender assumptions, biases, and roles, and how to produce more equitable gender relations. So we started by talking about some of the differences in, for some larger classes, you might be more limited in the types of alternative assessments, or at least I think we felt like that because of the large group setting. But of course, discussion can be an opportunity to develop rapport with students. And for me, I use discussion as a way to assess students along the way. 2 concrete examples we thought of, maybe an analysis of gender in the media, so how people are portrayed. And I did an assignment with my grad students on how the teacher union leader in Chicago, who's a female, was portrayed in the newspapers in Chicago versus the mayor, who's a male. And so her picture on the Tribune is like this big, monstrous, like, roar kind of face. And then the mayor is like in a suit and very polished. And just what that says about, the differences in how gender is portrayed. So that was one assignment example. And then the other thing, just any sort of analysis of a social policy, whether that's sort of micro, macro level. One of the things I do with my students is an op-ed, where they're sort of forced to write a short, concise, ideally publishable document. So they have to do research, they have to take a position, and that is sort of a way to assess how they're looking at a social issue, I think. Great. Anything else?
Oh, we contributed.
They
You nodded, you agree, yeah.
writing. Okay, classroom dynamics.
So the brief description of the class, an introduction to the practices necessary for successful college writing, reading and analyzing college level text, writing a process that includes invention, drafting, revising, and editing. One of the things we thought that might be useful is having students collaborate in a Google Doc and sort of from peer to peer, of both talking with each other as well as assessing the assignment. And also going beyond traditional research methods, not just going to the library for an assignment, but really encouraging students to think of the research environment as a more dynamic and safe space. And then Dean Welch mentioned about it towards the very end, so this is kind of, I jotted this down really quickly, but student input on rubrics and expectations. So it's not the instructor that's creating the expectations and the rubrics, but it's also student driven and it's a conversation and exploration.
Well, to have a conversation around what respect means, what civility means, sure. and so that it's not my definition of respect and civility, but it's a class joint.
Good. Great. Thank you all for participating in this. What Ashley is going to do is talk to you about your own specific course, but what I hope you got from this is the fact that even if you think you can't apply some of these concepts to a genetics course or a comp sci course, you actually can. There are ways that you can maybe take assessment or classroom dynamics and infuse it in some meaningful way within an individual course. And one thing before I turn it over to Ashley is I heard a lot of overlap. I heard a little bit of content over here with assessment. I heard a little bit of instructional activities over here with the classroom dynamics. So they're not static, they're not siloed. Once you kind of focus on one, you might see yourself bringing in some of the other three as well, which is what we hope you'll be able to do. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Ashley now.
All right, so we talked about examining self first as being that first step and really thinking about how to build an inclusive classroom. And Keonya has just given us some great ways of thinking about building and looking at our courses to really build that inclusive classroom. And so what I'm going to talk about are specific teaching strategies that I've used, and there are a lot more out there, but I'll just share with you 4 that I've found to be pretty helpful with identifying whose perspective is missing.